Welcome everyone to the SERVIR West Africa training program on data stewardship and the CoreTrustSeal requirements. And this is session 3 of our 3-part series. And this is coordinated by AFRIGIST. I'm Bob Downs, and I'm from CIESIN, which is part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Oh, my slides aren't forwarding. Let me see if I can fix that.
You have to sometimes click on the slide before you actually move it forward.
Oh, yes, there we go. Thank you very much, Alex. And so this is our third session. And as I said, I'm your instructor today, and I'm the Senior Digital Archivist at CIESIN. And the training program, for those who are just joining, the key topics are an approach to institutional self-assessment, looking at data, product, and service management and planning for the CoreTrustSeal certification. And this is going to involve lectures, questions, and discussions. And we have a couple of homework assignments that have been submitted that we'll be going over today as well. And all the sessions are recorded and will be available in a few locations. So for our current session today, we're going to review what we had talked about in the previous session. And we're going to look at the completed homework assignments for CoreTrustSeal Requirements 8, 11, 12, and 13. Then we're going to take a first look at requirements R15 and R16. And then after that, we're going to review some of the CoreTrustSeal requirements that we hadn't had for homework during these 3 sessions, so that we'll get a better look at those. And then we can look at some of the online resources for improving data stewardship and attaining CoreTrustSeal certification, followed by a few closing remarks. So we're going to first take a look at some of the things that we talked about in our last session, such as the data stewardship concepts, principles, and the instruments, and talk a little bit more about repository sustainability, as well as the CoreTrustSeal certification requirements. We're also going to look at some organizational aspects of data stewardship and then review all of these requirements. So you might recall that we had talked about the open archival information system functional requirements, and these are really a foundational approach to getting your data repository to be trustworthy. So we certainly want to work with our data producers and get the information from them and obtain sufficient control of that information so that we are able to preserve the material and make it available for future users. Part of that involves determining who our community of users are. That is our designated community. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We also want to ensure that the information is independently understandable. That is, the members of the designated community should be able to understand how to use the resources that are being provided to them and how they might be able to apply them to their current information needs. Part of this also involves following preservation policies and procedures that we create within our own data repositories. These things don't have to be set in stone. We can change them over time. But if we do have them written down in policies and procedures, everybody in the organization knows what to do and sees exactly what we can do to improve our practices as well. And then finally, we want to make sure that the information that we do receive for dissemination is available to the designated community so that they can begin using it. And this is not just today, but we want to make sure that this information is going to be available over time. So you might recall that we had introduced the GIOS data sharing principles, the GIOS data management principles, and the trust principles, as well as the FAIR principles and the CARE principles. I think an important thing to understand about these principles is the GIOS data sharing principles, the GIOS data management principles, and the trust principles. They all pertain to facilitating the capabilities of a data repository so that the data repository can then serve its communities and provide data over time. In contrast, the FAIR principles and the CARE principles, they tend to pertain primarily to data. Obviously, the repository will be responsible for providing access to the data and for making sure that the FAIR principles and the CARE principles are appropriately addressed. However, when we think about the FAIR and CARE principles, it's important to think about how the data are being provided and used and acquired, where with the trust principles, the data sharing principles, and the data management principles, it's important to think about the capabilities of the data repository and how we operate the data repository. So here we can look at the data sharing principles, the data management principles, and the trust principles in terms of some synergistic opportunities for implementation. And what that means is when we apply the data sharing principles and the data management principles and the trust principles, there are ways in which we can address more than one principle at the same time. So for example, we could be trying to address data sharing principle 1, which is associated with open data, and providing the data without charge, etc. At the same time, we could be making sure that data management principle 1, 2, 4, and 10 are all being addressed. That is, we could be providing metadata so that individuals will be able to discover the data. We can provide access online and ensure that the data documentation is available so that the users can access that and understand the data, as well as providing persistent resolvable identifiers so they can come back and find the data. At the same time, we can be facilitating transparency, user focus, and using technology to facilitate the accomplishments for attaining the trust principles. So these are examples of some of the things that we can be doing in conjunction with each other. So we don't have to necessarily say, oh, how do I do this or meet this one principle, when in fact we can be meeting multiple principles and addressing the issues associated with multiple principles at the same time. And the reason we might want to do this is because we can become more efficient in terms of the development of the data repository and improvement of its capabilities. As another example, we can look at data sharing principle 3 on the left, where we talk about providing access to these resources with a minimum time delay. And in terms of the data management principles, that means we want to make sure that our data quality control efforts, our efforts to do data traceability through provenance, et cetera, and through making sure that the data are preserved, are all done in an efficient manner so that the data will be available right away to the designated community. And in this sense, we're engaging in responsibility and sustainability activities for the data repository. Wanted to touch again on the sustainable stewardship aspects of providing access to scientific data. Remember, these are valuable assets. We've invested a lot in them, and so we do want to make them available, and not just today, but over time. And what that means is we want to enable reuse of these so that the value can be achieved, but we also want to make sure that the repository can continue to operate over time so that these resources will be available for future users. And an important aspect of this is to recognize that our future users might have different needs than our current users. So, as we're working with our user communities, we really need to keep an eye on how the resources are being used and how we might be able to improve capabilities for using the data, and particularly enabling the users to understand how they might be able to use the data. One aspect of sustainability is looking at our platform for the data repository. That is the systems, that refers to the hardware and the software, as well as the humans, our organizational staff, and others who might be involved in the process. And so, we might look at ways in which we can share resources and develop partnerships with others. We can have custom developed platforms, that is, develop a system ourselves within our own organization or with other organizations that we're working with. We can also have a centralized system where it's all housed in one location and operated and being developed by the same people. Alternatively, the system could be distributed where parts of it are being operated or even enhanced by other people. We can look at an open source approach, that is getting operating systems and software and the data repository system that's open source, that is openly available and free to use by anybody who might access that or decide to use that system. Or we could choose a proprietary approach, that is software that's been developed by, say, some company. And but we could also look at a system that includes both open source and proprietary software that also provides opportunities for development in terms of open source, but at the same time might take advantage of some capabilities available from, say, a particular software provider or vendor. Another way is to look at acquisition, say, of a complete system or obtaining components to put the system together. And we might do this by working with vendors and having contracts or through other kinds of relationships. Regardless of the approach we take, and there are many others, the important thing here is to make sure that we know how we can go from whatever system that we're choosing to the next system that we decide to take up. And this is referred to as an exit strategy. And so if we're putting our resources on a system, we want to be able to take those resources off the system and put them on to the successor system. That is a system that we choose to migrate to perhaps in the future. Looking at some of these different approaches, if we're taking a whole system approach, we might not even know the components that are involved in the system. To us, it might just be a black box per se. On the other hand, if we are adopting components, we might have to be familiar with every single component and how the different components interact with each other. And how we might be able to swap out components. That is, if a particular component is not ideal for us anymore, or we see that it won't be ideal in the future, we can look at ways of replacing that particular component with another component. We also can look at different types of shared data curation services. For instance, we might decide to have the repository services done in-house or parts of them done in-house. And we can see here some different repository services listed, such as ingest, storage, and discovery. But we also could have these services conducted by others. They don't all have to be conducted by the same organization, and they could be provided to our user community through a network, for example. Some of these other services, such as system services, might be initial services that we take on, such as installation, and we might have a vendor do that for us. And they could be even hosting it at their own site or providing support for us, as well as maintenance and further development. Some of the data services that we might want to engage in are activities such as data product development, creation of metadata and maintenance of it, as well as documentation, and assigning persistent identifiers, as well as long-term preservation. Similarly, there are different types of review services that we could do either in-house or bring in others. These might involve the initial appraisal of a particular data product when we are trying to decide whether we want to acquire that for dissemination to our designated community, or it might involve reviewing the product that we're about to disseminate prior to its dissemination so we can ensure that it will meet the needs of the user community. Another review service might be getting repository certification. That is where we ask the external community to review our repository in terms of its capabilities so that it might be certified as being trustworthy. Some organizational services that we could either be done in-house or in conjunction with others are things like strategic planning, selecting the different types of technology that we might adopt, staffing, we could do that in-house, or we might decide to involve contractors in that, for example, or some kind of consortium, as well as training and professional development of our staff. So here we're just looking at an example of a distributed data repository where the different units in terms of operations might be provided by either different organizations, or they could be done by the same organization or different parts of the same organization. An important thing to do in terms of sustainability is to recognize the balance that can be achieved between the costs and benefits. We want to make sure that anything that we're going to do that incurs costs is going to provide sustainable benefits to the organization so that we can continue to operate over time. And this might involve the initial acquisition activities, or developing products or services that we might provide to our user community, as well as curation activities or different types of peer review. Likewise, support and preservation activities should be done with the sustainability in mind. Thinking about the different CoreTrustSeal certification requirements, what we want to do is to continually improve the data repository, and the CoreTrustSeal requirements can help us do that by identifying different opportunities in which we might be able to improve. We also can take advantage of the CoreTrustSeal requirements to assess our repository in terms of its current capabilities, looking at particular areas that need improvement and what's involved in completing those improvements. And then along the way, once we have decided that we have met a lot of these requirements, we can try to attain certification. And certification through CoreTrustSeal involves this external review process, and it's valid for 3 years. So once you get your certification, it will be good for 3 years, but the expectation is that over time, the the repository will continue to try to improve in terms of the different CoreTrustSeal requirements. And I should mention that the CoreTrustSeal requirements also evolve over time. So every few years, they are being reviewed by the community to identify ways in which the requirements can be improved. So in effect, we're all trying to improve not only individual repositories, but as a community of data producers and data providers and data users. So let's take a look at some of the completed assignments that we received for CoreTrustSeal Requirements 8, 11, 12, and 13. We had talked about these last week, R8 being appraisal, where we're looking at how the data that are being considered for dissemination might serve our community, and whether we would want to accept these data and develop them appropriately to provide them to our designated community. Likewise, we want to look at data quality and how we might let the users understand the quality aspects of the data. So we would want to provide information about the quality of the data to the users and do this consistently. Likewise, we want to develop workflows so that the operations of the data repository are routine in a way. That is, we're not trying to create new capabilities or new procedures every time we accept another data set for dissemination. We have an understanding of our process and can follow that process. Likewise, of course, we're going to want to improve our processes over time and test them as we go along to make sure that they will work and integrate with our current processes. And then the data discovery and identification, where we're ensuring that the community can find our data and be able to access it over time and understand how to use it over time. So Anastasia Wahome and Eugene Brown both submitted examples for R8 appraisal. And I'm not going to read through all these, and I should actually say that they've both provided us with a lot of information, and I'm not presenting everything here, but providing you with some good examples of what they've shared with us. And so you might notice that Anastasia and Eugene both have mentioned the adoption of the ISO 19115 standard. So here they're trying to address the needs of the community by looking at available standards, selecting those as standards, and employing them so that their metadata schemas, for example, are meeting the requirements of those standards. Looking at data quality, CoreTrustSeal requirement number 11, Anastasia and Eugene both submitted great examples here as well. And Anastasia, for example, she's mentioning about their data policies addressing issues such as data integrity, validation, and correction. Eugene, he's also mentioning how they're working within the geo network to configure it in such a way that the metadata are available to their users. This way, the users can understand the quality issues about the data and understand how the data might be applicable to their particular needs. Looking on at the CoreTrustSeal requirement 12 workflows, where we're talking about workflows for the entire process that the data repository might initiate from when it's first acquiring data all the way through dissemination, including support of the data. Anastasia wrote how the RCMRD policies have explicit roles for data collection, maintenance, and availability, and integration, document and handling procedures. So this is nice how Anastasia has mentioned all of these different aspects that are involved in their workflows. Similarly, Eugene has talked about the descriptions of the data that they provide in their data repository and how they inform users about the general purpose of the data and how they perform quality and quantity checks. So both of these are great examples of how workflows are adopted and followed, made operational at their respective data repositories. And then looking at R13, data discovery and identification, Anastasia mentioned the search capabilities that are offered, the metadata catalog to facilitate users' search through queries and enabling them to access the different resources provided. Likewise, Eugene mentions the search functionality as well. And these are both good points to bring up in terms of data discovery. I should mention that Eugene also indicated that they're allowing the data to be harvested as well so that the users will have access to them. I also wanted to share with you some quotes from some certified repositories so that you can get a flavor for how some of the certified repositories have addressed these different requirements. So for R8, we see that the Roper Center, they are defining the accepted sampling design and data collection methodologies allowed for submission. So this way, those who are thinking about submitting data will understand what the expectations are. Similarly, the ODM archive talks about the different standards in quality and usability that they're applying to address disciplinary norms for their user community. Regarding R11 data quality, we have an example here saying that their submission information package requirements include that they contain documentation for appraising the quality of the data. And this is very important because you want the users to be able to understand whether the quality of the data is appropriate to their particular application. Similarly, the ODM archive, they talk about addressing the data quality requirements in terms of their archive collection development policy and how that sets requirements for the quality standards for accuracy, interpretability, completeness, and readability of the documentation, as well as the file formats. So these are great examples as well of how data quality might be addressed. We also have some quotes for R12 workflows. And so the data lifecycle approach is mentioned here at the Roper Center, and they actually provide evidence, that is a link to their website where you can look and get additional information. The ODM Institute, they talk about their workflow document and how that is dividing their different processes into 4 stages. And they talk about deposit, the triage, processing, and access, and how they provide services to their community through all of these different processes.
Can you define the terms AIP and DIP?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. So an SIP is a submission information package, and that is the resources that a data producer provides to the archive. That is, the archive needs to receive the data and accompanying information about the data, and putting all of this information together is referred to as a submission information package. And so within the repository community, this is referred to as a SIP or SIP. Similarly, an archival information package refers to the package that the archive or repository has put together for this data to preserve it for future use and to ensure that it's usable. So it might involve everything that's included in the SIP, but not necessarily. There might be some information in the submission information package that's proprietary. Perhaps there's a contract, for example, that is confidential, that they shared with the archive, and the archive would keep that confidential, of course, but they would receive all of this information and put it in an archival information package so that this information can be preserved for the future. Based on this archival information package, the repository can create a dissemination information package. This is referred to as a DIP, or sometimes referred to even as a DIP. And this is the information from the archival information package that will be disseminated to the public. And so we see here, really, it's three different manifestations of the data. The data producer is producing the SIP and submitting that to the archive. The archive is creating the archival information package so that this can be preserved over time. And then based on that archival information package, they're creating a dissemination information package to provide to their consumers. And this dissemination information package, they might be providing or creating for one group of users, but they also might decide to create a dissemination information package for another group of consumers as well. So they can create many different types of dissemination information packages from one archival information package. And then looking at requirement 13, data discovery and identification, the ROPR talks about user being able to search the question level IPOL database using keywords, for example, so that they can identify a particular a data product that might be relevant to their information need. And then here we can also see in this other example from the Odom Institute that they're facilitating use by enabling faceted browsing. And what that means is they're providing different categories of information that users can utilize to identify particular data sets of interest. So these could be categories such as themes or subject areas, or they could be based on dates or even the authors. If the users just remember that they wanted data that was produced by a particular author, they might want to just search for that author's name and be able to find the data that way. So we hadn't yet talked about the CoreTrustSeal requirements for technology, and there are two of them, R15 and R16. Just to recap a little bit, you might recall that we mentioned that the CoreTrustSeal requirements, they're divided into three categories. That is, you're looking at organizational aspects for some of the requirements. You're looking at digital object management for some of the requirements. And then you're looking at technology for some of the requirements. And two requirements are associated with technology. And these are R15 technical infrastructure and R16 security. And the general idea here is that you want to make sure that these systems will continue to operate over time. That is, that you do have the support that's needed so that you can provide the services to your designated community. And at the same time, as specified in R16, we want to make sure that our systems are secure. And when we talk about systems being secure, it's not just the hardware and the software, it's also the physical facilities that where the hardware and software are located. You know, these repositories aren't just really hardware and software. We have people involved and organizational structures and various efforts working together to make these systems work and work over time. So some of the questions that we might ask ourselves in terms of meeting the requirements for CoreTrustSeal Requirement 15 are, what standards are we adopting? And whether these are standards that are applicable to our own community or whether these are international standards, and what is the review process for such standards? And as well, we have to look at how we've implemented the standards. And obviously, different organizations can implement different standards in different ways. And so we might ask if there are any deviations from the standard, for example. Similarly, we have to look at the plans that the repository has for continuing to develop its systems and improve them over time. Likewise, we're looking at maintenance, and part of that is the documentation about the system. Can all people who are responsible for operating the system access the documentation for the system? Are there particular procedures in place where they can contact the necessary person, that is the individual with expertise, or even a vendor who might be able to help if there's an issue? Similarly, we're looking at the bandwidth and connectivity, whether that is enough for the community, and whether there's a disaster plan, a business continuity plan, and in the event that something did happen to the system, such as a disaster, whether there is a way to recover from the backups that might enable us to resume operations immediately. So for technical infrastructure requirements 15, the Roper Center also in its certification application mentioned how it meets these requirements. And you'll notice right away they're talking about the Data Documentation Initiative standard that they've adopted, and the ISO 3166 standard for geographical metadata information. They're also talking about different protocols, such as hypertext transport protocol for security, and the JSON language that they're using within their systems. And they talk about how these were developed internally by their own IT software development team. And they also mentioned that these were developed in Java. So these are recognized languages, for example, recognized protocols, recognized standards, so that they can continue to operate their technical infrastructure utilizing these approaches. Similarly, the Odom Institute, they talk about the adoption of ISO 27002, the Code of Practice for Information Security Controls, so that their servers are maintained with, for instance, regular security scans and monitored, so that they can identify any vulnerabilities in their system. Looking at R16, the requirement for security, this is referring to ways to protect the facility over time. And so questions that we might ask for security include whether the IT security system and its employees have roles for security. That is, are there people taking responsibility to address risks? And what levels of security might be required for operating the repository? And any procedures or protocols that are in place, for example, for authentication or authorization. And then looking at the technical infrastructure, how is that managed? Is this managed by a host institution, or is this outsourced to somebody, or who is taking responsibility for all of these aspects? And looking at the security of access to these systems, one question we might ask is, for example, how our systems personnel and other authorized individuals within the repository can access these. What security protocols might be in place? For example, here we look at two-factor authentication as a means for protecting access to sensitive data. And then we also want to ask questions about security policies, the physical facility security, and any password policies that might be in effect, for example. And we have a couple quotes here as well from certified data repositories. So the Roper Center talks about their daily backups that take place twice a day, and how they have multiple data storage locations. And this way, if there is a disaster at a particular location, all of the data are not destroyed because they are stored in other locations as well. And then the Odom Institute talks about their physical access controls and how they have 24/7 security to prevent unauthorized entry on their systems. They talk about their virtual private networks, etc., and the password authentication processes that are in place, as well as their routine processes for applying patches. And I should say that what a patch is, it's a jargon, unfortunately, but it's referring to code or other capabilities that might be enhanced within the system. And so we might have identified a security breach or a potential security vulnerability in our system, and a new portion of code could be written to address that security breach, and then we could employ that as what is called a patch, that is, replace the vulnerable code in our system with the code that has been written to address this vulnerability, and put that in as a patch to ensure that our security is improved over time. So we didn't have homework assignments on some of the different requirements, and so we're going to review those a little bit so that we can ensure that they're covered as well. And under context, there's only one requirement, and that's R0, so we'll touch on that. Under organizational infrastructure, requirements R3 and R4 didn't have assignments. And then we didn't have assignments under digital object management for R7, R9, R10, and R14. So we'll cover them as well a bit.
Bob?
Yes.
I think if this is fine to go through these briefly, but we really need to leave time for our participants to ask questions they may have about material we've covered thus far. So I would just go through this as quickly as possible. I don't think you have to read all the text on the slides, just basically cover the lights. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And so, yes, in the R0 requirements, we do want to provide context. And you can see here some examples where we, for example, provide a brief description, a level of curation, and talk about our partnerships that we might have for the repository, either in-source or outsource. The designated community is an important thing to understand in terms of being able to address our community's needs. And so here I'm providing for you the definition for designated community that's in the Open Archival Information System framework. And both the domain repositories and generalist repositories might serve the public, but the difference might be in that the domain repositories are prioritizing their services for specific users, where the generalist repositories might not be doing that as much. So I'm going to provide a brief example from the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center, known as CDAC, in terms of how it describes its and identifies its designated community. So here we're looking at the results of a study that we had conducted, where we looked at the different journals that had published articles about the use of CDAC data. And each of these journals is representing different fields. And so what we see here in this chart is the different fields that were represented by the journals that published articles about these CDAC data. And what's interesting is that you'll notice that, for instance, environment, ecology, and geosciences is the majority of the topics that are addressed and reported in the journals that published articles about the CDAC data. But you'll also notice there's a good proportion of social science information and other areas such as biology, biochemistry, economics, engineering, etc., and plant and animal science. So this way, CDAC can understand how its data are being used, and it can use this information to identify ways in which it might provide additional data products and services to its community. Looking at the organizational infrastructure aspects for R3 and R4, R3 is dealing with continuity of access. And in particular, we want to make sure that the risks are addressed and that we have plans in place, such as contingency plans, to address any unanticipated circumstances. Likewise, with confidentiality and ethics, we want to make sure that we are meeting the norms of the designated communities and any ethical principles that the community has adopted. For R7, R9, R10, and 14, as I said, these are associated with digital object management. R7 is data integrity and authenticity. Here we're looking at integrity checking, which might be done with fixity checks, for example, or how version control is performed. Documented storage procedures that are described in R9, they're looking at how the data are being stored, where they're being stored, whether we have multiple locations, and whether we might even have procedures for recovering those data in the event of a disaster, for example. Our 10 includes the preservation plan, where you describe the policies, et cetera, associated with the preservation of the data holdings. And our 14 is addressing data reuse. That is, how the data are described so that the community can understand them both today and in the future. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the resources here that are available online that we can utilize, but you can look at these later. The slides will be available as well as the recordings. And so here we can see the CoreTrustSeal offers lots of resources. And if you look at the very bottom link, CoreTrustSeal.org, from that link, you can get access to all of these different resources, such as the requirements, the extended guidance, and procedures for applying for certification. And the fees, for example, are described there, as well as opportunities to obtain a waiver for those fees. Other online resources include the reference model for the OIS, the Open Archival Information System, and other resources that are available from the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems. And as I mentioned earlier, these have been adopted by the community and are actually standards now. And so likewise, the Global Earth Observation System of Systems, or GEOS, data management principles and data sharing principles are available online from the Group on Earth Observations, also known as GEO. For the different principles that are out there, the care principles, the trust principles, and the fair principles, we have links to those resources as well. Also, there's some links here. There's the top link is for the International Science Council Committee on Data International Discussion List. You can join that list by going to that website. The Research Data Alliance, also known as RDA, has lots of valuable resources there as well. GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, has many resources, and the World Data System also has many resources. Also, many of the different resources that I've referenced in these slides, I've included here in links as well. And so I do have a few closing remarks I wanted to leave you with, and that is ways to get started with data repository improvement. And here you want to consider the requirements in terms of both your current and your long-term needs. So this involves prioritizing those criteria that you want to address so that you can begin improving on them right away, and balancing your resource demands by leveraging opportunities. That is, the community is showing you their needs. Other repositories are developing capabilities. Some of these other organizations, which we've pointed to, are also providing good examples of ways to improve your capabilities, and we can take advantage of them. And we want to collaborate with the other data repositories because we can all learn from each other and then use these to plan for our improvements. One thing, though, that is very important is that we need to obtain buy-in from stakeholders. And what I mean by that is our user community. They need to inform us about their needs so that we can understand how we might meet those needs. But also within our own organizations, our management professionals and others, experts in our information technology staff and other units within the organization can all work together, but we all need to understand what we're trying to achieve and work together to achieve our objectives. So in that sense, we want to bring others along, establish a business case for what we plan to do so that we understand how we're going to do it, and tie our business case to our current priorities, and along the way make sure that we are attaining efficiency by learning and building on existing tools that are out there that others are sharing with us, and test frequently. We also want to prepare the data repository for CoreTrustSeal certification by performing an initial self-assessment. Once we've identified our gaps, we can prioritize those gaps, identify different opportunities to address our gaps, and then leverage the synergies, different opportunities for addressing more than one gap at the same time. And we want to prioritize these efforts so that we can make some progress and assess how we're making that progress along the way. Once we've addressed most of the core requirements, or I would say even all the requirements to some extent, but certainly met many of the requirements, we can consider developing an application for CoreTrustSeal certification and applying for certification. So I did want to leave you with this concept of continuously improving the scientific data archive, which we've looked at before. And in this regard, we can continuously look at ways in which we can improve our repository, look at how the repository can be improved, and then begin applying those improvements, preparing for an audit, and then receiving an audit which gives us good suggestions for how we might be able to improve, and then applying those to further improve and continuously improving the repository over time. And so with that, I would like to invite any questions. I can't see the questions in the chat, but perhaps if there are some questions that Alex, if you see them in chat, you might want to read them. Or
there aren't any questions right now. So I'll pose a question, and then I'd like to leave this time open between now and the 30 minutes past the hour for any other questions that participants may have. So as a member, you serve on the CoreTrustSeal board, and you also have reviewed many applications, as I have before I stepped down from that role. One question I have is how frequent it is for data centers to submit applications for which a number of the requirements are not completed, they're in process. So there's I think a 0 to 4 scale where 0 is not started or even considered, and 1 is, I don't know, you can describe that scale, but 4 would be completely implemented. And so I think particularly for developing country data repositories, understanding whether it's feasible to say, and whether one could get certified by having, say, a majority of 3s, where there is at least a clear implementation, a plan for implementing the standard, but it hasn't necessarily been achieved yet. Or, in what cases there might be dispensation to allow some 2s or 1s. Again, you need to tell us what the scale was, but maybe you could share a bit, Bob, on the current thinking and approach to that particular issue.
Yes, so generally speaking, the scale works from 0 where you haven't looked at the requirement per se, or where 1 you do identify that the requirement offers opportunities, but you haven't really addressed it. 2, you're starting to look at ways in which you might be able to do that. 3, you have developed a plan for actually implementing the capabilities in that particular requirement. And then 4, where the requirement has been completely implemented. That is, the capabilities of the repository are in place and operational in terms of meeting that particular requirement. So yeah, and I really appreciate this question, Alex, because I'm always asking myself the same question when I'm conducting reviews. And I should mention that the reviews are conducted by more than one individual. The reviews are often conducted by teams of reviewers, and the reviewers are working together to identify ways in which the repository has met the requirements in terms of how they're described in the application, and how the reviewers can offer suggestions if a particular requirement is not met. I also should mention briefly that the reviewers, they are representing the different repositories that have undergone the certification process. So the reviewers have all been through this themselves, and because the certification only lasts for a few years, the reviewers are continually trying to improve their own data repositories to meet their next certification. And so the reviewers are very familiar with the requirements, and I should just mention too that I and many of the other reviewers just attended a series of workshops that were provided by the CoreTrustSeal to reinforce our understanding of the different CoreTrustSeal requirements and how we might be able to work together to help data repositories to meet the requirements and to conduct the reviews of those data repository applications. And so we recognize that every single requirement does not necessarily have to be a 4 that is implemented and operational. A repository is, though, expected to have several, and in fact, a majority of the requirements should have been met by the repository prior to their application for certification. Well, I think that if the repository is submitting an application with lots of 1s and 2s, for example, that's not really a lot of progress. And so in these cases, what I would suggest that the repository should do is continue to conduct self-assessments, continue to improve by prioritizing those requirements that it can establish plans for example, and making incremental improvements to try to address those requirements that it has identified as being priorities. Often by meeting or working towards addressing one requirement, a repository can see opportunities for meeting another requirement. And so my suggestion is for the repository to continue looking at its 1s and 2s and try to get those all into at least a 3 category before even considering applying for certification.
Let's move on then. There was a question from Sylvia Elena, and the question is, she's certain of the importance of certification of data repositories, but she has some questions based on successful cases. How much time and energy or in money is invested in that process? Is it required that 100% of the staff be involved in the actual development of the responses? And is it possible to know if there are donors who support this type of initiative? I think I might take a first crack, and then if you have additional responses, Bob.
Yes.
The first time that you go through this, it's probably going to require, you know, a couple months time, not of concerted 100% time, but of internal consultations, which speaks to your second question, and development of responses that are reasoned, and development of documentation, because one of the requirements of CoreTrustSeal is that not only that you have procedures, but that those procedures are actually published on your website to the largest extent possible. Obviously, things like security plans and other things that might be sensitive information are not published on the website, and that's completely understood. But the basic information about procedures and the community focus, the actual sort of disciplinary community that you're addressing, open data policies, things of that sort should be documented on your website. So not only will you need to actually respond to the question, but you should also, you know, in the process, develop a data, say an open data plan or something like that. I noticed that several of the groups, or the two groups, SERVIR and RCMRD, have done something of that sort. They've got some kind of open data policy that they have published. But it's not a trivial task. That said, the whole goal is to get your operations to be better. So it's actually benefiting your data center and hopefully enhancing the reputation of your data center by actually going through the process. In terms of the participation of staff, it's certainly the simplest thing would be for one person who understands the entire data management process from start to finish to essentially write the responses, and then to have senior managers sign off. We're in fact at CDAC somewhat guilty of that. We basically delegate the task to Bob Downs, who does the responses. Then Bob Chen and myself, as manager and deputy manager of the NASA CDAC, review. But one thing we realized recently was there was actually misunderstanding about some of our policies and practices among other staff, including other projects that manage data at CIESIN, and that we needed to have wider understanding and wider buy-in to some of the approaches that we take to data and data management. So what I would say is that it's best to involve a larger team, but I don't think it necessarily implies having every scientist or every person at your institute involved. I think it involves bringing in the manager of the data center or center where you're based, and probably 2 or 3 technical staff, who maybe someone on the IT side who really understands the technology side, someone more on the archival side like Bob Downs, who really understands archiving, and engaging them in the responses. And you may find there's other questions that you need to bring in other people, like the scientists may know best who the user community is for your data center. So these are some of the things that you might want to consider in the process. As far as support and funding, okay, so there's one other element that I didn't cover in response to question 1, Sylvia Elena, and that is that there is a €1,000 fee. That fee is reduced for developing country data centers, and I'm not sure if it's fully waived. Bob, do you know if it is?
Well, it really depends on the circumstances. A particular repository that's in a developing country is certainly eligible to apply for a complete waiver. Whether they get that waiver or not may also depend not only on the repository circumstances, but on the circumstances of the CoreTrustSeal, that is, the CoreTrustSeal has to maintain its operations as well. And so the fees help the CoreTrustSeal to maintain its operations. And if it is providing lots of waivers and it's not getting any fees coming in, it could be in a precarious position in terms of paying its own bills. And so in that case, it may not be providing as many waivers
Okay,
as
so
like to.
understood. So the last question that Sylvia Elena had was if you're aware of any groups that provide funding to help data repositories essentially pass the CoreTrustSeal requirements, or more generally to improve their operations. Maybe I'll take a first cut on that, and then I would say that in some instances, project funding, and I'm speaking now for Paul Bartel, and he may disagree, but I think that, for instance, with the SERVIR network, I would assume that some of that funding could be dedicated to the data platforms that you all are standing up for the SERVIR network. And I think it would be a matter of negotiating essentially with the USAID funder in your region to determine how much of the funds from SERVIR could be allocated to the data architect, to setting up the data center. And then, whether or not they would approve of coverage for staff time to prepare and then submit the CoreTrustSeal application or self-evaluation. So that's one option. The other is you may have other donor-funded projects that are essentially dependent on data being archived and disseminated. And one thing that we need to say more generally is it's not a problem only in the developing world. Data management and data archiving are not often it's not always easy to find funding for these operations. And Bob Downs knows very well that many massive projects or NSF projects require data management plans, et cetera. But many times the PIs or the principal investigators of those projects actually don't put any money towards data management or data archival. They essentially assume that that work will just be done by somebody else free of charge. And so there becomes a gap between the expectations of the funders that all of these data be archived and what happens in reality, which is that the archives are not always supported by the scientists who are conducting the work. So I think these are issues that do arise. We've had the benefit, obviously, of long-term and long-standing funding from NASA, but we understand that many data centers have to piece together funding from multiple sources in order to make their data center actually work. Bob, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that or sources of funding that might help some of these data centers do this important work.
Yes, yes, and as you mentioned, there are two aspects to this, and one is improving the data repository so that it can meet the requirements, and also the effort to apply, and that might mean completing or enhancing different policies and procedures. So yeah, that's all one source of funding that you might need to tap into for those efforts, but also in terms of the application itself, the fee for that, and in some cases, yes, it might be waived. But what we have seen now in several countries actually is different groups have gotten together and they have created proposals for projects that would help data repositories to become certified. And so what they have done is they've gone to different funding groups, either agencies, government agencies, or benefactors, foundations, etc., and said, we propose to help other repositories, a whole group of them, to get certification for CoreTrustSeal. And what they're doing in this regard is creating a consortium of these organizations and getting funding from these different sponsors to do that. And they've been helping each other. So we've seen a few of these taking place. There was one in North America that we saw a couple of years ago, and they had several data repositories applying. Another one I think we saw recently in Canada that was taking place. And here again, funding was obtained so that it could help different repositories to move towards certification. And so these consortiums are a very good way to go. And also, I should mention that when a consortium applies for CoreTrustSeal certification with 10 or more data repositories, they can receive a 10% discount on the certification application fee. And so there's another benefit to being a part of a consortium that is applying for certification. Another advantage we've seen from these consortiums is that they work together. That is, they're helping each other to identify ways to improve their capabilities within their data repositories and to improve their applications. And so I really can't emphasize enough the importance of working together. We can't do it alone. We all have to work together and learn from each other, and being part of a consortium is a good way to do this.
Now, one thing that we may be able to do at CIESIN, we have actually zero leverage over SERVIR, but I have discussed with Dan Irwin the potential for having CoreTrustSeal certification be part of the lasting legacy that SERVIR leaves behind among its partners. So if there were, what is it, 10 or more, I think, Bob, 10 or more data centers. So if there were a total of 10 data centers that were part of the part of the SERVIR network across the world, then it's possible that, NASA might actually just cover the fees right out of pocket. And they do that, for instance, for our data center. They cover it not out of our operating budget, but separately for all the NASA DACs. There's 12 of them. So I think this would be a very interesting thing to bring forward. If others are supportive of this, it might be good to hear from you in the chat. And I'd also be interested to hear Anastasia, if she's still on, of your experience in this domain and how you've managed to fund the work that you've done so far, because it sounds like you're a little further ahead of some of the groups in West Africa in terms of developing the certification, developing the standards and developing some standard practices for running your data center. And I'm wondering how you managed to fund that. So Anastasia, if you're still on.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And I think one of the things that I thought maybe could seek clarification, this may be a question to clarify about what we actually define as a data center. I know at RCMRD, we kind of apply the same policies across the board, but we do have like separate data portals, some for different projects, others for clients, and but we also have like what we maintain is what we call the RCMRD data portal, which is what includes data that we develop ourselves, or for projects that have no restrictions on sharing, such as SERVIR is one of them. And yeah, so I think that's something I would want to hear, whether all the portals, for example, treated as one data center, or would they be treated as separate? And now answering your question, first of all, in terms of the organizational infrastructure, within SERVIR, we have staff who are specifically employed with data management as part of their core tasks, as well as RCMRD also has core staff whose mandate or whose job description is to manage the data within RCMRD, and not just the data that's within the portals, but also with clients and other stakeholders. So we do have several positions that are enshrined in our organizational structure. That means they are fully funded by RCMRD and for the SERVIR project as well. In terms of maintaining, for example, the infrastructure, the computing capacity, the storage and all that, RCMRD in its budget incorporates a budget for data maintenance, for the capacity, the computing capacity for storage. And SERVIR also contributes to that. And one of the things we realized at some point, this wasn't part of a budget, like about 3 or so years ago. But we realized the challenge that was there because under SERVIR, we did an assessment that brought out the big gap in terms of funding and the technical expertise in terms of staffing. But when this was raised, RCMRD took it up as an institution, and it's something that is approved by the governing council of the institution. That means there's a budget every year. And we're also looking into having other projects that are done by the center also chip in by ensuring that if you're bidding maybe for a proposal to do a certain project, one of the components in the budget is for data maintenance. So that's one of the ways we look at it. I hope I've answered that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I would say that, so the network question you asked, it would be individual data centers applying for membership. And it's the same for us under the NASA DAC system. Even though ESDIS, which is our parent organization, the Earth System Data and Information System, pays the fees, we still have to go through the process individually to submit and adhere to. But adhere to the requirements. One of the advantages, though, that we found is that if there's commonalities, and in this case there were commonalities among the data centers, there are common elements of the ESDIS architecture and ESDIS approach that we could provide what we call boilerplate text, or text that basically covers those requirements, at least describing, the common elements, so that then all you need to do is fill out the data center specific elements. So if the same were true of the SERVIR network, there were common elements, then there may be ways to allow to have one person essentially fill that out for the network as a whole, or for all the data centers in the network, and then it can be copy and pasted into each of your individual applications. I hope that is clear. One thing I'm going to do, even though this has not been fully vetted by my colleagues, as chair of the scientific committee of the World Data System, I'm going to share an MOU that I developed that I believe we can move forward with for the purpose of this candidate membership category. And I'm just going to put it in the chat. You can download it if you want. This letter of agreement would be filled out by whoever has the authority at your data center and filled out and signed basically to take on responsibility for agreements. This is a light agreement, so it's not like there's any heavy obligations. There's no certainly legal ramifications for signing it. but the idea would be that you would formally enter into a candidate member status that would essentially mean that WDS would seek to provide some assistance in partnering you or buddying you with another data center. For instance, we at CDAC, could potentially serve as a buddy for one of your data centers, and we would try to find other data centers within the WDS network. For those of you, again, who are not familiar, don't remember the World Data System, I'll just copy and paste the URL. Sorry, I sent that as a direct message and I did not intend to do that. So I loaded a file and it did not go to everybody. So now it's going to everybody. And then this is the link to the World Data System to give you more information. Just to repeat what I said at the outset of our training, if you want to become a member of the World Data System, you actually have to have completed the CoreTrustSeal application and have been certified by CoreTrustSeal. As I've said before, that does not mean that you have to have a 4 across the board on all the requirements, but as Bob suggested, you should have a 3 or 4 for most every requirement. And if there's 1 or 2 exceptions, then probably that means you will be asked to try to complete and get up to level 3, which essentially says you have not completed it yet, but you are working towards that, and you have a plan for working towards that. So the goal of this candidate membership is, again, to get more members from the developing world data repositories that may need some additional assistance or capacity building to achieve the requirements. You could, go to the buddy or partner data center in some other part of the world that agrees to take on this role, and essentially ask them how they went about fulfilling certain requirements. You could review their application, which is on the CoreTrustSeal website, and there would be some assistance that could be provided to get you to the point where you're ready to be certified. So I encourage all of you to take advantage of that. I guess I'll close with that. Personally, Bob Downs, I don't know if you have any other further words that you'd like to add. And then, of course, we're available if you have individual questions through email in follow-up to this. So, Bob?
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you for your attention here. And also, I'd like to thank those who have provided their examples for meeting different CoreTrustSeal requirements. Anastasia and Eugene, your examples are very helpful for everybody to be able to identify ways in which they can begin improving their repositories in ways like you have done. And also want to thank AFRIGIST for having organized this, as well as SERVIR for supporting this effort. And again, thank you all for your attention.
Great.
Thank you.
Glory,
Yeah, thank you.
Glory, any final words from your part at AFRIGIST?
Oh, thank you very much, everyone, for being a part of this. We really appreciate you, Dan, for being a very good facilitator here. We appreciate you sincerely, and of course, Alex. And before we go, please, everyone that participated, I've sent you some forms. Kindly help us to complete those forms and return them. I will need them for post and pre-evaluations, please. Thank you so much for being part of this. Have a nice day.
Well, with that, thank you everybody for participating and for your sticking with 3 days of fairly intense programs. We will put this recording up on our CDAC website. For those who missed the link to the earlier trainings, I think they're in Glory's email, so you can look to Glory's email, and there's some recordings from the earlier training that we held. And we're happy to answer any specific questions you may have individually after the training. So thanks again, and thank you, Bob Downs, for your wonderful presentation, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.